So I just want to say thanks so much again to Judith and Joe and the organizers for putting this event together and including me, and to everyone for sticking with it. So in the spirit of humor and building off all of the wonderful presentations this weekend, especially Bambi Hagen's talk yesterday on stand-up comedy and survival, I wanted to start with an anti-colonial joke, but I'm not a great joke deliverer, so let's ask Hari Kondabolu.
The time on the news, 2042, for those of you who don't know, 2042, apparently, according to census figures, is the year that white people will be the minority in this country, right? White people will be 49% in 2042. And I don't know if there are people in this audience that are upset by this, but don't worry, white people, you were the minority when you came to this country. Things seem to have worked out for you, right? But here's the bigger point. Here's the more important point. 49% doesn't make you the minority, right? That's not how math works, right? 49% white only makes you the minority if you think the other 51% are exactly the same.
All right, love it. So sourcing its punchline from the history of expansionist colonialism, whereby white settlers systematically displaced, dispossessed, and decimated the native and indigenous populations of America, while fueling the nation's domestic economy through the enslaved labor of Black people, Hari's joke seeks a bit of lighthearted relief from the incongruity between white supremacist racial panic about becoming a minority and the evidence of how that's never stopped white people before in their ruthless will to power and genocidal domination. So not to be too much of a killjoy in my explanation of Hari's very amusing anti-colonial joke, I'd like to preface my talk, which will mostly focus on slapstick silent film comedies produced in Europe on the brink of World War I, with a bit of discussion about the broader framing for this symposium on matters of empire. So what is empire? For me, any concept of 21st century empire has a foothold in Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's exploration of this topic in their 2000 book Empire, which was followed by Multitude and Commonwealth, kind of a nice early 21st century Marxist trifecta. So as Hart and Negri wrote in the late 1990s, empire is materializing before our very eyes. Over the past several decades, as colonial regimes were overthrown, and then precipitously after the Soviet barriers to the capitalist world market finally collapsed, we have witnessed an irresistible and irreversible globalization of economic and cultural exchanges. Empire is the political subject that effectively regulates these global exchanges, the sovereign power that governs the world. The decline of sovereignty of nation states, however, does not mean that sovereignty itself has declined. And in their book, they go on to emphasize the biopolitical mechanisms of empire sovereignty that mark some bodies as criminal, right, such as the terrorist, or potentially any Black person in the proximity of a police officer, and that further lord over its citizens through various life-making techniques. So if the old mode of sovereignty governed primarily through the power to make, die, and let live, the new paradigm allegedly flips that dynamic on its head by making live and letting die. And comedy itself is potentially implicated in that former entity of making live. So Sian Nye calls this zaniness in her book, Our Aesthetic Categories. Zaniness is exemplified by comic performers such as Lucille Ball and Richard Pryor in her account. So the zany for Nye is basically like the affective motor of neoliberal capitalism. The zany is a fleet-footed, hot to trot, carnivalesque spark plug whose boundless reserves of energy and good feeling, performative happiness, grease the wheels of an otherwise deeply alienating, exploitative, and increasingly untenable economic system. And Olenka Zupanchik and other psychoanalytic humor scholars like Slavoj Žižek and Alfie Bohn would also emphasize comedy's injunction to enjoyment. So comedy's injunction to enjoyment, this is a quote, marks the point at which permitted enjoyment, that is the freedom to enjoy, is reversed into its opposite, the obligation to enjoy. And maybe this dynamic has actually shifted somewhat since the pandemic, which I think would be a really interesting point of discussion for later. But in recent years, many people have felt a kind of terror about failing to enjoy themselves, not enjoying themselves, of not having enough fun. And no end of TV laugh tracks, gimmicky internet emojis, or Candy Crush capitalist phone games can ever reassure us that we're ultimately thriving in our daily access to pleasure and enjoyment. And again, I'd be really curious to think collectively about whether this injunction to enjoy still has the same hold today, when really any yield of lighthearted fun or pleasure whatsoever feels increasingly vital just sheerly for surviving the everyday news cycle. So as we know, a lot has changed since 2000 when Hart and Negri published Empire, let alone since March 2020. But to Hart and Negri's point, the specter of ethno-nationalist sovereignty has now collided headlong with the hegemony of multinational empire, thanks to our friend Donald Trump, the rat king of COVID, and Bojo's Brexit campaign, and Modi's Hindu nationalist movement in India, and so many other such examples from across the globe. In other words, the pandemic of neoliberal empire has been a breeding ground for the resurgence of nationalist bigotry, which is not to say that racism, xenophobia, sexism, right, all those wonderful things didn't exist before 2016, but that the escalating class inequality cultivated by the neoliberal economic policies has dangerously intensified all of the above, to speak to Matt's lovely portmanteau neoliberalism. But my question today is, what can humor do? Right, what can humor do? What reparative work can humor still do? We all know that not all humor is inherently progressive. It can be triggeringly offensive or structurally complicit, as with zaniness. But on the flip side, what can humor offer beyond just providing sheer emotional relief and psychological catharsis, and even beyond the kind of satirical truth-telling of political satire that's increasingly limited to one's own cultural echo chambers? That's the problem with political satire is, you tend to only encounter forms of satire that you already agree to begin with. But how can humor itself help jam the wheels of multinational empire? How can it do that kind of structural work? So unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that question, the million-dollar question. At the end of the day, as many of us have commented already, I feel like affective survival through even lighthearted laughter feels like a pretty good outcome, even if it does not that much to kind of help envision, let alone transform the bigger picture. But as a silent film historian and a self-diagnosed victim of archive fever, I'm interested not only in what humor can do going forward, but also in what it could have done in a counterfactual but not immaterial version of the past. That which could have been, and maybe even that which momentarily was, but then was summarily forgotten. This is the kind of speculative temporality of I don't know, my commitment to feminist comedic silent film archives. So this leads me nicely into the second part of my paper, and to the kind of leap of faith in my argument beyond merely diagnosing the social malaise of the present as if it wasn't already abundantly apparent. So now I'm going to invite you all to time travel with me back to the very early 20th century, actually to Europe circa 1910 to 1914. Just on the precipice of World War I, which, as we know, dragged on for almost 5 years and killed over 20 million people, there was a cycle of extremely popular but horrifically violent slapstick film comedies. And I'm going to play a few clips in the background without sound, without the recorded music, and just talk over them, just to give you a sense of the kind of recurring physical gags and spectacles of total apocalyptic mayhem on display in many of these films. So the typical setup involves some kind of domestic mishap or minor conflict that escalates into world-shattering comical violence. So this film is called Leia and the Ball of Wool, It was made by the Cinese Company in Italy in 1913, and it stars the actress you see here, Lea Junkie, a teenage girl who's told by her parents to tend to her knitting. Instead of reading her book, she wanted to stay in and read. So she responds by completely destroying their entire home in her violent quest for a missing ball of wool, which you can sort of see turns out to have been attached to the back of her skirt the entire time. You can see it here. And she just continues her rampage. And then at the end, her parents are like, okay, you can read your book. All right, so in this next film from July 1910, a teenage miscreant named Leontine, who was an internationally popular character. She was known as Betty in the US and the UK, and Leontine or Titine throughout Europe. Leontine plays a series of extremely sadistic pranks on her neighbor and townspeople using a piece of string, as you see here, to trip people, to bait them. String is her weapon of choice in this comic series. And things sort of escalate from there. And can you see this? Were you able to see that these GIFs?
Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
You're good now.
This is Leia and the ball of wool. Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it now.
So let's just watch briefly of her destroying her entire home. And now you can see the ball of wool that's attached to the back of her skirt. So it's like totally, and not like she's just going on a rampage. I know I sort of described it, but it's worth, they're just destroying everything. It's really funny. All right, and this, I just want to play the intro to, so this is Leontine with her piece of string. She's tripping people. And playing various, and then the angry mob starts to form. And please jump in if you're having any kind of visibility problems with any of the clips. So seething with anger, her victims form a vengeful mob and chase after her, eventually attempting to lynch her. Leontine narrowly escapes, and I'll just skip ahead. She narrowly escapes by disguising herself as a scarecrow and putting the actual scarecrow on mounted horseback, which the angry mob captures, and then they basically lynch the scarecrow instead. So here's the next clip. Leontine guards the house. Similar kind of premise. I think this one is from 1912. It's the last episode in the series. And all slapstick comedy is violent, right? It's displaced physical violence from the commedia dell'arte bataccio. That's what slapstick does as a genre. Thinking of like the frequent dynamite explosions and Roadrunner and Coyote cartoons. But these 1910s film comedies, and this is really key to the argument I'm trying to make, these 1910s comedies were particularly referential in their depictions of domestic social unrest, decontextualized gender rebellion, and world-ending physical destruction. They evoke something like Mikhail Bakhtin's utopian notion of carnival by celebrating the death of the old world in order to make way for the birth of the new one. So in addition to provoking laughter through violent but ultimately harmless comic gags, these films envision the absolute destruction of a world that can no longer contain the restless energies and unformed ambitions of an alienated younger generation. That's really the sweet spot of their utopian spirit. And I apologize if you can hear my neighbor's lawn hedger in the background. They do a tremendous amount of yard work. It's extremely annoying. But back to the utopian spirit of these violent slapstick comedies. They're about destroying the world that one no longer wants to inhabit in order to try to imagine something better. All right, so yet another Leontine clip. This is from Leontine's Boat. And just a little bit more context about the series. It was produced between 1910 and 1912 in France, in Nice, and it featured about 25 episodes. So in this one, as you can see, Titine is attempting to sail her toy boat indoors, but instead ends up flooding the whole house. And the Leontine series was incredibly popular. As I mentioned, it was exhibited internationally across Europe and North America, possibly elsewhere throughout the kind of colonial circuits of European empire, but I have no evidence that it was, but it could have been. And the actress who played Leontine is actually still unknown. We don't even know her name. And this is why, if I can give a bit of a brief plug, I'm currently co-curating a 4-disc DVD Blu-ray set with Kino Lorber, with Laura Horak at Carleton University and Elif Rongen-Kainachi, who's the silent film curator at the Eye Museum in Amsterdam. And we've somewhat anachronistically titled our DVD set, Cinema's First Nasty Women. And it'll feature over 100 short early films that thematize feminist uprising, cross-dressing, labor activism, gender play, and the extravagant violence of domestic rebellion epitomized by Leontine from the very earliest decades of cinema. And we've already programmed some of these materials at silent film festivals, such as the Pordenone Giornate in Italy and the Mexico Silent Film Festival in Puebla. And the title of this talk, Tyranny at Home, was our framework for a screening of short films that we programmed last year in Italy and Indiana, including titles such as The Kitchen Maid's Strike, Leontine Enfant Terrible, Rosalie Has Sleeping Sickness, and Zoe's Magical Umbrella, in which a bored housemaid uses stage magic to overproduce commercial umbrellas with predictably extremely disastrous consequences. So I want to play one final clip, of course, of Leontine again, because I'm obsessed with her. This is from Leontine's Electric Battery. I find these anarchic visions of apocalyptic comedy to be vividly redemptive, not because they necessarily model the activity or behavior we'd like to see in an ideal or utopian society, but because of how they level the violence of slapstick against punitive biopolitical norms and law and order repression as such. As Hannah Arendt has put it in a very different context, empire abroad entails tyranny at home. And by that, Arendt attempted to raise the alarm about how the very techniques of domination that white Europeans had long inflicted on its colonized subjects had finally come home to roost. The first German concentration camps were not in Dachau or Bergen-Belsen in the 1930s, but in Namibia on Shark Island in the early 1900s, where thousands of African men, women, and children were imprisoned and systematically massacred from 1905 to 1907 in Namibia after attempting to rebel against the brutal exploitative conditions of German colonial rule. So the subsequent atrocities that Nazis perpetrated against their own German people in the 30s and 40s were not singular to state fascism, but an extension of the long-standing expansionist delirium of European empire building. So on the brink of the First World War and the collapse of hegemonic European empires, such as the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians, we see the specters of that colonialist violence coming home to roost in a very different light. We might even say that the failures of empire abroad provoke oppositional imaginations of tyranny at home. And as I stated in my abstract for this symposium, the dismantling of empires abroad always has a foothold in the slapstick politics of how we imagine, critique, and repudiate these ideologies of tyranny at home. And I'll go out on a limb and say that circa 1910 to 1914, these feminist anarchists, hell-raising tomboys, and labor activist kitchen maids vividly and evocatively did precisely that work. And the world today should take note. Thank you.